Good afternoon, everyone. Tonight, in our IMS lecture series, our speaker is Professor Miriam Galante. Miriam Galante teaches modern and contemporary history in the University of Madrid, the Autonomous University of Madrid, and she is a specialist in Latin American history, and especially in the history of Mexico. She has conducted for years research in various aspects of political, social, and cultural history of Mexico, and she's particularly interested in the cases of identities, national identities, and other political and social identities in Mexico. So tonight, her talk is about indigenous people and contemporary challenges and historical experiences. And I think it will be stimulating for us because we don't have often the case, the opportunity to hear talks about Latin American and other countries that are far from Europe. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Yeah? Can you listen? It's okay? Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Apostolos. I thank Apostolos Delis for the invitation to share with you these notes on the indigenous world in Latin America. I also thank the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, for hosting an entire team of noisy Latin American people. And finally, I thank the Portada team for the good moments we have shared over these past days while resolving ambiguities. Overview of indigenous people in Latin America with a special focus on Mexico. Let's start with the current situation. Indigenous peoples are distributed across all continents, although Asia is the continent in which the largest number of indigenous peoples live. Nevertheless, it is in Latin America that indigenous peoples pose a highly consolidated tradition in the defense on their demands. Probably, their actions have achieved the greatest international projection amongst those carried out by the indigenous people worldwide. According to recent data endorsed by the United Nations, it is estimated that there are more than 476 million people in the world who consider themselves indigenous. That means 5% of the world's population. That 5% constitute 50% of the world's poor. In other words, there is a close relationship between indigenous peoples and poverty. In total, worldwide, there are more than 5,000 indigenous people present in 90 countries and inhabiting 22% of the Earth's land surface. Among them, approximately 7,000 languages are spoken, most of them endangered. The existence of this multitude and variety of indigenous peoples constitutes an expression of humanity's social, cultural, and ethnic diversity. It is also natural diversity. 80% of global biodiversity is in indigenous territories. It is important to take into consideration that indigenous peoples are frequently attributed a conservation function. Somehow, they're supposed to be the guardians of the biodiversity. The presence of indigenous peoples in Latin America is significant. At least 800 of these peoples are located in Latin America and the Caribbean. A total of 58 million, which constitutes approximately 10% of the total population. 550 indigenous languages are preserved in the region. The Latin America country with the largest indigenous population is Mexico, approximately 70 million, which represents only 15% of its population. The highest proportion of indigenous people is found in Bolivia, with 62% of the total Bolivian population, which is a lot. The countries with the largest number of indigenous peoples, as you can see in this slide, are Brazil with more than 300, afterwards Colombia with 100, and then Peru and Mexico. It is often assumed that each indigenous people speaks an indigenous language, but the studies carried out by the Fund for the Development of the Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean show that it is not always the case, which already invites us a reflection. What then is the element that defines indigenous people? In recent decades, and especially since the 50s and 60s, the notion of indigenous peoples has been conditioned by the assignment of rights. In fact, it can be said that since the beginning of the 20th century, the rights of indigenous peoples considered necessary to be protected have progressively expanded. Health, education, culture, respect for their traditions and customs, environmental rights. This does not mean, however, that these rights have been effectively guaranteed. Several actors have participated in this process of definition. The leading role played by international organizations is particularly striking, especially the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. It is also relevant the increasing importance of the subjects who recognize themselves as indigenous. National states, of course, have also been crucial actors in this process. The indigenous questions, that is, the attempt to improve the living condition of indigenous peoples, emerged associated with indigenista policies of Latin American states, always within a continental context. In a second phase, it will be the international framework that will largely determine the priorities and ways of improving those conditions. Often, that international dimension has served the communities themselves as a strategy to pressure their states, which were reluctant to recognize their demands. Initially, the definition of these peoples began in a peripheral manner. It was not the central objective of the legislation being proposed. They were included because they were similar to other groups that were seen as needing legal protections: workers, peasants, and any collective suffering from a condition of exploitation, especially labor exploitation. The assignment, therefore, was linked to a class condition or disadvantaged social extraction. Gradually, other factors gained relevance, such as cultural and identity elements, especially from the 60s onward with the United Nations Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. At the same time, their cultural difference ceased to be regarded as a factor causing social and economic lag, and came to be assumed as a constitutive value of their identity and therefore deserving of respect and protection. International organizations changed their attitude toward indigenous peoples. They ceased to be obsessed with integrating them into national majorities and began to adopt formally more respectful positions regarding their traditions and cultural expressions. Indigenous peoples also began to organize globally and through international networks, claiming the right to decide for themselves what was most appropriate for them. Thus was consummated the transition from a model of indigenous assimilation to a multicultural model. In this model, social diversity was considered desirable value in a social context favorable to cultural relativism. In fact, there is a close relationship between the critique of colonialism and the recognition of indigenous rights. In this regard, the mandate given to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of indigenous peoples, known as the Martinez-Cobo Report and published in 1986, was especially relevant both in diagnosing the principal problem suffered by the indigenous peoples, This was also an attempt to characterize the collectives. A few years later, in 1995, the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations took up the main points of the report and opted not to propose a close definition, but rather to describe shared factors. And here in the slide, you can see the main factors related with the using of the territory, with cultural issues, the distinction, the perception of being distinguished from the majorities, and also issues of identity. But I think that the most important element was probably the experience of subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, exclusion, or discrimination, regardless of whether these conditions persist. Finally, in 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognized that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Therefore, according to that document, they should be able freely to determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. However, it also reflected a tension that remains difficult to resolve and persists to this day. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as authorizing or encouraging any action that will impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Since then, United Nations resolutions have pointed toward new areas of protection for indigenous peoples and the elements essential in their ways of life, many of them endangered due to the overwhelming attitudes of global capital, globalization process, or the states themselves. Among these are guarantees concerning environmental protection, linguistic diversity, and the safeguarding of traditional knowledge, some of which is at risk of appropriation by large multinational pharmaceutical corporations. The attitude of states on this matter has been, at very least, ambiguous. They have referred to these collectives as in diverse ways, and constitutional recognition has likewise been multiple. In most cases, states have sought to preserve sovereignty by carefully measuring recognition of the right of self-determination. Perhaps this tension is best observed in the elaboration of census, where through specific markers, states have attempted to identify diverse indigenous populations in order to reconstruct an imaging of the nation that overcomes the simplifications and rigidities of 19th century national models. Curiously, disputes in the elaboration of this census regarding which ethnic groups appear and which should appear but do not have led to demands for recognition of new ethnic and identity groups. These censuses have become a field of contestation that allows the construction of a differentiated citizenship with significant consequences, insofar as they sometimes entail not only statistical information, but also legal and political repercussions. So the liberal nation-state's idea of legal equality seems seriously challenged. A final note, not a minor one. Since at least 1976, Second Declaration of Barbados, with the Second Declaration of Barbados, indigenous collectives themselves have claimed the right to speak for themselves, not only to speak, but also to act beyond their state's borders in a global context. They want to generate unity and synergies with the demands of other collectives and undertake actions to claim the respect and denounce abuses. At times, globalization is also an opportunity for the public internationally projected claims of their rights converted into a common cause. Once we have seen the current situation and challenge indigenous peoples face, let's jump into the historical perspective of the topic. The definition of the notions of Indian, indigenous, and indigenous peoples has changed over time. We sometimes forget that it has its own historical dimension and is therefore conditioned by the context of each moment. Thus, we can understand the slow transition from the notion of Indian, a colonial and homogenizing category, to that of indigenous peoples, a post-colonial notion intended to make evident the multiple and diverse nature of the collectives, as we have already seen. Some connotations change in this transition from indigenous to indigenous peoples, but others persist. It should be noted that, albeit with different expressions, in both cases there is a certain protective purpose. Reference is made to a device of rights, although for different reasons and with different aims. So the category, as Bonfil Batalla has already very widely explained, the category of Indian is a supra-ethnic category that does not denote any specific content of the groups it encompasses, but rather a particular relationship between them and other sectors of the global society system of which Indian form part. The category of Indian denotes the condition of colonized and necessarily refers to the colonial relationship. It has, as I have already said, its own history, linked to the uses and meanings attributed to it since its appearance. Precisely, I have sought to gather in this table the way in which the indigenous person has been presented from the arrival of Europeans to the present. It is a generic and somewhat simplifying proposal, but I believe it is useful in providing an overall view. Three relevant historical moments can be established. The first one, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, a context in which the social system was organized in a plural manner. Its social group coexisted with others, but each with its own rights and obligations, what is known as juridical pluralism. In that situation, the indigenous person was associated with notions such as natural, neophyte, new in the Catholic religion, that means new in the Catholic religion, vessel, tributary, and miserable, among others. Of particular interest is the condition of miserable, which refers to a person in need of protection due to lack of resources, education, and moral strength. It was a legal condition, also applicable to those considered rustic, to children, and to widows. Indigenous peoples were recognized as requiring particular protection. A special court of justice attended to their cause and was required always to moderate any penalties imposed upon them. For example, they could not be tried before the Inquisition. They had the right to live in community, following their lands and customs, and were guaranteed certain communal property necessary for their survival. In exchange, of course, they had to recognize the king as sovereign, fulfill basic Catholic requirements, and above all, pay tribute. The second moment, late 18th century to mid-20th century, was strongly determined by the process of nation-state construction in Latin America, especially with elites driven by the goal of population homogenization. At the beginning of this period, the new states had great expectations regarding their possibilities after independence, and the indigenous person was initially recognized as a citizen. Therefore, he had equal rights and obligations as any other member of the nation. However, paradoxically, this implied dismantling some protective mechanisms of the previous system, making indigenous people more vulnerable in material terms. In the second half of the century, expectations of incorporation into modern values were frustrated, leading to rejection. Indigenous cultural practice were blamed as obstacles to civilized life and as a problem to national progress. The state developed public intervention aimed at dismantling elements of indigenous cohesion. For example, the breakdown of communal lands during the Mexican reform land in the Middle Age of the 19th century. Although the main objective of this reform from Mexico was economic, their consequences were disastrous for indigenous communities. In other contexts, biological and symbolic extermination campaigns were undertaken. In some cases, mestizaje with European origin population was proposed as a transitional solution, even as national origin narratives were grounded in a mythical indigenous past. In the third phase of this second period, during the first half of the 20th century, indigenismo, particularly important in Mexico, represented a sincere effort to improve living conditions, especially in health and education, though it ultimately entailed process of acculturation. I cannot enter in detail on this long-term perspective, nor refine all its nuances, but I must nevertheless mention a couple of issues, even if they may prove controversial. First, the Crown's effort to issue ordinances for the protection of indigenous peoples as early as 1512 and later in 1542 did not necessarily respond to reasons of faith of purely humanitarian concerns. The Crown needed a population that would guarantee control of the territory in a context of imperial competition, and it also needed to secure revenue collected through tribute. The Crown presented itself as the protector of the indigenous population because in this way it could also prevent the emergence of powers or individuals who might mediate or interfere with its control over the Indies and especially their lucrative trade. In this context, indigenous peoples posed two instruments of direct communication with the king, especially if they were victims of abuses or if local authorities exceed their powers. They could address the monarch directly to restore order by dispensing justice and presenting petitions describing injustice or abuses and requesting redress. Their right to petition, although not exclusive to indigenous people, was used by them very frequently, even after the colonial period during the Republic era, as we will see afterwards. A second mechanism consisted of initiating judicial litigation. As previously mentioned, in New Spain, they had access to specific tribunals, notably the Tribunal General de Indios, which handled cases involving indigenous parties expeditiously. The recourse to this mechanism was so frequent that historiography has referred to the figure of the litigious Indian. No less relevant is the organization principle of social collectives. This principle was not raised by a far more complex notion, calidad. This notion referred to one's position within the social organization and was based on factors such as place of residence, for instance, if they were resident of a pueblo de indios, type of dress, occupation, guild membership, and the saints celebrated in local festivities, among others. Calidad implied a placement within the social structure and therefore access to a specific set of rights and obligations. This nuance is important because it suggests that social needs were not determined strictly by race or biological or phenotypical markers, despite the insistence of much Anglo-Saxon literature to the contrary. Certainly, origin mattered, but more in terms of social provenance than race. Moreover, some degree of social mobility was possible, as demonstrated by the studies such as those by Berta Ares in the Viceroyalty of Peru. Only toward the end of the 18th century did race become a more significant distinction, and it would not become predominant until the late 19th century with the rise of social Darwinist theories. To understand how all these factors interacted in Mexico, I would like to share some reflections based on my research on justice in a specific territory of the country, Tlaxcala at the moment of independence. That means 80-20s, 80-30s. My study addressed two aspects. First, from a political perspective, the petition submitted by indigenous alcaldes to the national government. This was a period of intense tension as a dispute arose between the principal city, Tlaxcala, and smaller towns over territorial control. This conflict reveals the multiplicity of interests within the indigenous world in the region. Second, I examined judicial proceedings involving indigenous individuals. Those provide valuable information about how indigenous persons were represented and how they represented themselves in legal cases in a context where the principle of legal equality prohibited formal distinctions or exceptions. Both areas of research are important because they allow us to observe indigenous actors in action and reveal the complexity and diversity of interests within indigenous collectivism, recovering what historiography calls indigenous agency, which, as these experiences show us, is not exclusive to the 21st century. Tlaxcala occupied a particular position since the arrival of the Castilian conquerors. Its collaboration in the conquest of Tenochtitlan was rewarded with the Royal Ordinance of 1545, recognizing it as a población realenga. That means they directly depend on the king without intermediaries. All the towns and lordships of Tlaxcala were unified under the denomination Province of Tlaxcala. It was a República de Indios, that means a legally recognized Indian community governed by the Cabildo de Indios, enjoying significant autonomy. All inhabitants were recognized as indigenous nobility, the only case in New Spain where an entire ethnic collective obtained such status. This exceptional condition persisted until the first federal constitution of 1824. In addition, this small region had a commercial significance, being located midway along the route between the port of Veracruz and Mexico City. It was a very economical, it's very important from the economical point of view. From 1786 onward, when the Spanish monarchy attempted to reorganize its relationship with the American territories, Tlaxcala oscillated between dependence on Puebla, and Puebla is the state just near Tlaxcala. Here is Tlaxcala. Puebla is just close to Tlaxcala. So Tlaxcala oscillated between dependence on Puebla and autonomy. Okay. By the late colonial period, the region comprised in total 1 first-order head town and 6 second-order head towns. It has the principal, the capital, and then 6 other little towns which were very relevant. With the monarchical crisis of 1808 and the need to hold elections, this territorial organization was used to elect representatives to the Junta Central and later to the Cortes of Cádiz. In the first case, it turned out that Mexico representative was precisely the Tlaxcala Miguel de Lardizábal Uribe, the first one there. This is from Goya, the famous painter. In the second, it was José Miguel Guridi y Alcocer, who incidentally would later participate in the country's independence and proposed that the Mexica eagle be incorporated in the national flag. So that's the person who decided that one. The 1812 Constitution of Cádiz radically transformed traditional organization. Control of the capital shifted from the indigenous population to mestizos and criollos with commercial interests. Liberal laws also permitted the creation of new ayuntamientos in towns with at least 1,000 inhabitants. This produced a local revolution, with the capital's council became dominated by mestizos and Spaniards. Indigenous alcaldes in other towns gained institutional spaces to defend autonomy. New indigenous councils defended their autonomy in 3 ways. The first dispute arose during the constitutional debates of 1824. How would the territory be incorporated into the new Mexican state? Would it be autonomous as another province, or would it be included within the territory of another? The capital succeeded in having, in the Constituent Act, being recognized as one of the states of the country. At that point, the new Indian municipal mayors reacted by sending petitions to the national authorities. They did not wish to depend on the new constitutional city council of the capital and preferred to belong to Puebla. Ultimately, the National Congress decided to grant it the status of a territory, an exceptional situation that places it under the authority of the federal government rather than the capital. The President of the Republic will appoint a political chief to govern the territory. A second dispute then arose. The capital sought to establish a single judicial district for the entire territory in order to control what occurred within it. Would judicial cases depend on the capital or each municipal council? Once again, the mayor of indigenous town fought for their autonomy, arguing that the territorial demarcations used for the election of national representatives should also serve as judicial district. In a decree of March 1826, the Ministry of Justice ultimately recognized this jurisdictional plurality and therefore autonomy in the administration of justice in these territories. A third dispute, somewhat more limited and involving a specific mayor and the political chief, concerned what local communities regarded as an overreach of the political chief authority in judicial cases involving some form of special jurisdiction. Once again, the national authorities supported the indigenous mayor. This conflicted scenario reveals the capacity of smaller municipalities to deploy sophisticated legal knowledge to defend autonomy. Paradoxically, the capital invoked historical indigenous privileges, those arising from 1545, while other indigenous towns invoke liberal constitutional principles to defend themselves against mestizo and Creole marshals. Let's go now to the second type of I am just finishing, so but I would like to do some commentaries about the second type of evidence I have studied. Judicial records for Tlaxcala illuminate how indigenous individuals experienced the implementation of legal equality. What happened when social classification disappeared as defending different particular justice forum? Prior to 1821, legal documents identified persons by name, place of origin, residence, and calidad. It means if they were Indio or Spanish. After independence, classifications by origin was prohibited and special jurisdictions abolished. Over time, indigenous defendants stopped to use the term Indian status and instead employed rhetorical levies such as persona rustica, minor, or whitehood to claim the condition of miserable person, thereby seeking leniency. Some legal advisors even argued that the indigenous required a curador ad litem, a guardian for minors, despite constitutional abolition of classification, citing long-standing legal traditions concerning the simplicity of naturales. In most files, the term indio does not appear explicitly. Instead, references are made to naturales, común de naturales, común de ciudadanos, or vecinos. Here, the reference functioned not as a juridical category, but as a socio-territorial marker reflecting community belonging, occupation, and reputation. Indigenous litigants themselves strategically use such markers. The complexity of applying the category of miserable person, its gradual transformation into citizen, and the deployment of alternative social types in judicial proceedings reveal the tensions of the liberal transitions. So, to conclude, the term Indian possesses its own historical trajectory shaped by the uses assigned to it by actors, both those identified as Indian and those identifying them as such. At its origin, it grouped together subjects of diverse ethnic origin subjected to foreign domination. Its gradual replacement by the notion of indigenous people has sought to emphasize diversity and guarantee protection of collective ways of life. These dynamics have unfolded not only locally but also regionally, continentally, imperially, and now globally. They form an important part of contemporary international law. One final point. Indigenous intervention is not exclusively recent. Through history, indigenous people have sought means to protect themselves and avoid succumbing. Unfortunately, both in the past and in the present, not always successfully. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for this very interesting presentation on the indigenous people in Mexico and Latin America. I don't know if you have any commentaries, any questions, anything? Public? Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you hear me? Yes. It was a very interesting presentation. I saw that, I mean, what I could gather, it seems that indigenous as a term is, let's say, a category mobilized by social actors in certain moments.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could, I wonder if you had any comment, maybe linking the specific case that you studied with the overall usage of the term indigenous around the world. Because I noticed, for example, in a place like Greece, to take an example, which might fit all the requirements that the UN set out, you know, a Greek might call himself indigenous according to those.
But you mean nowadays or from a historical point of view?
I mean, if you follow the UN's requirements,
Okay.
whatever that means. I mean, at the beginning you say 5% of the world's population is indigenous, but I don't see Greece there. Just taking the example of Greece.
Yeah.
And Greece fits the definition, maybe. So I wonder to what extent indigenous is a term created, is a term that emerges from specifically European, Western European colonial encounters,
Yeah.
and not the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And then it gets globalized.
Yeah.
I don't know if...
It's totally like that.
Okay.
I mean, you are right. You are totally right. That's the reason. I mean, the Indian, in fact, it's a category made by the Spaniards. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, it's spread all over the world. So it's especially from Europe to Latin America, in fact. And then the United Nations, they spread it all over the world. But I mean, not all the countries can recognize the indigenous peoples of their countries, because if they recognize, they have to protect their rights. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah. So they have a lot of conflicts, for instance, in Asia or in Africa, because the states don't want to recognize the different type of ethnic groups like indigenous peoples, because if they do that, they have to submit to do all the international laws that they are obligated to do. So, It's right, you're right. I mean, it's from Europe to specifically to the Latin America, and afterwards it's spread all over the world, yeah.
Thank you.
Just a note that, I mean, as I see it, the main historic element that leads to this kind of definitions is colonialism. So this is why Greece is a difficult example. But if you want to expand, I think not only Spanish colonialism, but also, I mean, the whole of Africa could be described in these kind of terms, and also Southeast Asia, for instance. And if you want to go further than European colonialism, there is the example of Taiwan.
Yeah.
And because Taiwan was colonized in the 15th or 16th or 17th centuries, and there was a population of non-Han, non-Chinese indigenous peoples. I think they were related to the Philippines kind of population. And it's very interesting because if you see the Chinese, the development of Chinese views over the indigenous populations of Taiwan in the 17th or 18th century, they are very similar to the European ones. So you have again the image of the noble savage, like the Rousseau style thing, or you have the colonial view of you know, the wild peoples and so on. It's very quite interesting, yeah.
Just well, I suppose I should let you respond first before I ask. Or should I? Since it continues the discussion, I guess what emerges from your presentation, at least, taking into account what Marinos has just said, you know, let's say the common sense definition of indigenous is a person who really is from the place before other people came. Yeah. But in fact, maybe despite, and maybe this is what I would respond to Marinos, is that despite that fact, that's not how it appears to be used necessarily in the sources. Consider the fact that before the Spaniards arrive in the Americas, there's also displacement of populations. Consider the fact that that the Danish really are from Denmark and they are therefore indigenous, and they want to kick people out on the basis because they don't want immigrants. So is that indigenous rights? So the point being that it seems that indigenous, when examined analytically in this way, is not so much having been there first or something. It's more a specific legal category that emerges from a certain kind of Western state. Yeah. I don't know if this is...
It's like that, it's that. I was insisting all the time that it's a legal category with implies rights and obligations from the beginning. It's not a question of other thing. I mean, it's the reason why always are all the people over there was recognized as indigenous, because they were submitted in a category, in a legal category, and they have to treat like that. Which is for good and for bad. I mean, it's not, but it's that. It's a legal category. It's clear.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Other questions? Commentary?
Excuse me for continuing this conversation. Yes, sorry. Could we say that for understanding what we're talking about, if we could, in the sake of this conversation here, if we could change the term indigenous in the term of tribal societies. I mean, what is described here is the tribal societies in the modern, what did the United Nations
change the name when I mean, I have I have a lot of more information. I didn't want you to overcome with all this type of information. At the beginning, they were talking about tribal societies, but if you see from a Western point of view, it could be understood like if they were in a lower state of development. So the United Nations, and especially the International Organization of Labor, they decided to delete this type of definition because they didn't want to make the impression that they were just putting in a low level for this type of people. So it's not nowadays we don't use this term because we think it's not appropriate.
Yes, I know the politically correct
Yeah.
approach, yet
There are a lot of, I mean, when you see the documentation, you can see all the structure. They have a very consolidated traditions on politics and everything. So they don't feel they feel they have a different way of living, but not on previous state of development, which is different.
yes, exactly.
That's the reason they don't want to use the tribalism.
I know, I'm aware of the evolution of the terms. Yet, for the sake of this conversation here, it could be if you return to the first map, where the indigenous people in Africa, let's say, I mean,
it's different.
Okay, in Africa, the people that are described as indigenous people are the vast majority of the population of these states. Okay, and the way I understand it is that this term essentially points out to this
Type of
yes,
society,
exactly.
yeah.
To that. Yes. I mean, that's.
I mean, I didn't want to say because I don't want
Yes.
to
I
look
understand.
like if it were.
I will relieve you from the burden.
I didn't want to say, but I mean, when we began studying this type of things, we think that the term is originated in Latin America, which has a special colonization, which is different from other parts of the world. That means maybe we don't have here now, which is very strange for us, that the region with most indigenous people is not Latin America, although it was the place where the term was founded, was created. That's why it's difficult to explain because it also implies some type of historical reivindication with a lot of years, more than other countries. So I agree with you, but I know it's a little bit complicated from a political point of view, or I don't know how to say. And the other thing is that when it began they began doing this type of legislation, they were thinking not in indigenous people, but people from labor. I mean, people who were exploited. So the development became from there till now, which is a different issue. But
Any other questions? Commentaries? Maxi, notify me.
okay,
There is a slide.
which one?
That of the poster.
Yeah.
Where I had this question when I was in Mexico with the museum. No, it's
very much the first.
no. The other one.
This one?
No, the one in the middle. That was we put it on the poster.
The map?
No, it's no. Wait.
This one?
No. Here we are. Look, here says Biblioteca Nacional de Antropología e Historia. This is actually the name of the museum in Mexico City. Museo de Antropología. Here says Arqueología Mexicana.
That's
And the journal that publishes the Museum of Anthropologia is called Archaeologia. Well, is this a museum of archaeology? Is this a museum of anthropology? To me, as a Greek, was pure archaeology. But this is a major political issue in Mexico, as they say. That's why you might give some more commentary on this, because you know, for us it's a little bit strange. Why anthropology? Well, for us it's just archaeology.
Because they have to explain the ways of living too, I mean, today. So they use, well, first of all, I have to say that all Latin American researchers, we use anthropology, history, and archaeology in our research. It's very common, this type of interdisciplinary, okay? But also, because for Mexican people, it's anthropology because they study the ways people live today, looking into the archaeological rest. I mean, they study the rest and they try to explain the different types of societies they have inside.
Claiming the direct
connection
with
Okay. Although the the pass of the time.
It's one of the paradoxes, I think, is you see that you have these indigenous populations in order to combat, let's say, a nationalist vision. They just use the nationalist vision. Let's just say they have a language and a mythical past.
Yeah.
So they have the same logic.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah. And also the the states use the indigenous past in order to make national identity too. For instance, when you are studying the history of Mexico, you have to understand that the beginning of the historical of the Mexicans is from Aztecs or from specific groups, not all the groups, but some specific groups. Although they can be discriminated nowadays in the social practice, but the past is always the past, the indigenous past.
And why in the museum the word Aztec is missing totally? I've tried, I went around the museum trying to find the word Aztec. I saw Mexica, Olmeca, whatever you want. Aztec
you know
was
why?
missing.
Because I mean, it's different. The Aztec of the Mexicans. They are both two different type of
tribes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that the Aztecs has a very bad reputation also because historical persons say they were very aggressive, and also they prefer having a past, a more comfortable past. I mean, it's easy because Mexican they have the writing and they have a lot of different things, but Aztecs they usually are seen as violent and aggressive and everything like that.
And
so they prefer, but they are different types of people because the Aztecs come from the Aztlan, which is in the north of the country, and they were coming into the center of the country, okay? And the Mexicans were living just in the middle, was the population that came from the north, and they were living inside, just in the middle of the territory. So they were different people.
And Texas-Tiztlan, what is called this? Was Mexicans?
Aztlan was in the north. In the north.
No, the Mexico City today, the capital before, was inhabited by Mexicans, Mexicas, or Aztecas?
Yes, no, by Mexicans, they were there. Yeah.
But on the other side, if I remember well, you explained us that Mexico society is a very mixed society, that indigenous were part of the most of the population in other case, no? Because here you are explaining some specific cases of Mexico that they remains like indigenous, for example. But in the most of the case of Mexico, if I remember, you explained to me, I don't read in another place, no?
Yeah, but it was in the, can you put the table, please? It was made like at the end of the 19th century, okay? This mix, and especially during the Mexican Revolution. They make a myth of
It was from the beginning, it was in this moment, you say.
Yeah, in that at the end of the 19th century, while some countries were talking about the the necessity of being white or facilitating the incoming of people from other countries because they wanted to be more white. I mean, they thought that the indigenous people was a blame or something bad for the national progress. In Mexico, they thought that the mezcla was better. So, and they began doing that at the end of 19th century, and with the Mexican Revolution, it was the myth of national. It's the only case in all Latin America that they make the mestizaje, I don't know how to say the type of national identity. It's the only case in, yeah.
In some way, it's a indigenous national identity, more or less.
Well, they
not indigenous because it's not the same. But
no, it's not the same. Historical. It's a historical way it's a historical point of view because they think that they are mixed from indigenous people, and also they think the indigenous people is not only one ethnic group because they were also together before before the Spanish arrived to the continent. There were a lot of different ethnic groups, so they were mixed at the beginning, and afterwards the Europeans came, so it's all together. But Mexico was the only country in Latin America that put the mestizaje as a myth
Policy as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Thank you very much.